The word mind may sound intimidating. There is a term, awareness of objects, or perception of objects. This awareness or perception of objects is what we call the mind. So, the mind is simply the nature that is aware of or perceives objects. When we refer to it as a mind, we are using a conventional term. The mind has no location, no center, because it's formless. But sometimes, during meditation, you might see it as a form that is just a mental image, a fabricated vision created of a mind. Observing the mind isn't done with the eyes, but with feeling. We use our feelings to perceive. What do you feel? If it's something coarse, like greed, you recognize it as greed. Do you know what greed looks like? When greed arises, do you notice it? The mind is greedy, wanting to have, possess, to become, wanting this and that. Train in recognizing these mental states. For example, greed looks like this, and lust looks like that. They are of the same family, greed and lust. Do you recognize anger? See, it's not difficult. A state of anger exists. It's a feeling. If the anger is mild, it simmers subtly within the mind, right? If the anger is intense, it explodes in the head. Train in recognizing these mental states. When observing the mind, don't get caught up in the phrase, observing the mind. There's nothing to observe in the mind. It has no form, no substance. It's empty. So, if we try to observe the mind directly, we won't find it. We observe through phenomena that arise with the mind, which are mental factors like greed, anger, and delusion. These arise with the mind, but are not the mind itself. Greed is not the mind. Anger is not the mind. Delusion is not the mind. The mind is that which perceives objects. When our mind becomes greedy, we will see that greed is an object that is known, that is observed. Therefore, greed is not the mind. It is something that can be known and observed. The mind is the knower, the observer. The mind leaves no trace, no form for us to observe. It's like cooking gas we have at home. The gas itself is colorless and odorless. If the gas leaks, we could die without knowing. That's why manufacturers add a scent, so if it does leak, we can detect it. So, the scent itself is not gas. The gas itself does not have any smell for us to detect. The mind is similar. We cannot directly sense or observe the mind. We can observe it through phenomena that mix with it, like knowing gas is leaking because of the scent mixed with it. Phenomena that mix into our minds are like greed, anger, delusion. Train in knowing. Train in observing these. When greed arises, know so. Do you know what greed is like? When it arises, how does the mind behave? Can you answer that? What are the characteristics? When greed arises, when lust arises, there's a characteristic of pulling the mental object toward oneself, toward one's mind. When aversion arises, there's a characteristic of pushing away the object we dislike, we want it gone. When delusion arises, we cannot clearly perceive the object, can't discern it. The mind is not the singular and permanent as people generally understand. Rather, the mind arises and ceases continuously. One mind arises, one mind ceases, all day and night, continuously like a chain, unbroken. The mind arises and ceases so rapidly that we mistakenly think the mind is permanent, unchanging self. The mind arises and ceases rapidly. The Buddha taught this. Why can't ordinary people who haven't listened to the teachings see that the mind is not the self? Because it arises and ceases very quickly. It's so fast, it seems continuous, like one single thing. It's like watching a cartoon. We see a character, let's say Doraemon, a famous Japanese cartoon character. I don't know what cartoon characters are popular these days. I only know Doraemon from my time. We see Doraemon walking around on TV. In reality, it's just a series of individual images flashing rapidly in sequence. Each image arises and ceases in quick succession, creating the illusion that there is Doraemon. Our mind, too, arises and ceases so quickly that we mistakenly believe there is a mind that is permanent and constitutes the self. And this mind seems to perform all sorts of actions. But if we practice observing the mind until we become skilled at it, we will see that the mind arises and ceases all the time. One mind arises, remains briefly, then ceases. Another arises, remains briefly, then ceases. It's like this all the time. By nature, the mind can be aware of only one object at a time. At the moment the mind is aware of an object of consciousness, it cannot perceive itself. An example is when a practitioner is mindful of the body in the sitting posture, he is distracted and starts to think of something. He is no longer aware of the physical phenomena. His mind is rooted in delusion, moha mulasita. 5 minutes later, he realizes, sati, that the mind was thinking of something. Delusion then vanishes, and awareness arises in its place. The mind and the object are a pair. The mind means that which knows the object. The object means that which is known by the mind. There is a rule. The mind can only perceive one object at a time. If the mind knows it has wandered, it cannot also know the body. If it knows the body and sees the mind wandering at the same time, the practice is definitely wrong.